When using the Bible as a source for history, especially within academia, the closer you get to the present, the more reliable it's considered to be. And although there are still disputes over the historicity of particular events, it is still used as a general guideline for the history of that region at the time. But the periods of, say, King David and Solomon, although less externally corroborated, are far easier to make sense of than the following period of the kingdoms of the North and South, which even the Bible has trouble keeping straight.
It's so complicated that St. Jerome, the priest who translated the Bible into Latin, is believed to have said, "Read all the books of the Old Testament, and you will find such discord as to the number of the years of the kings of Judah and Israel, that to attempt to clear up this question will appear rather the occupation of a man of leisure than of a scholar."
You see, when you add up the number of years the different kings of Israel and Judah are said to have reigned, they don't really line up super well, and scholars haven't come up with a universally accepted means of deciphering the information. However, there are some that are more accepted than others, and the title of that goes to Edwin R. Thiel.
In 1951, Thiel published The Mysterious Numbers of the Hebrew Kings, which seeks to disentangle the reigns of the kings of Israel and Judah. He did this through a combination of accounting for concepts such as ascension years and co-reigning. He also discovered that the two kingdoms used slightly varied calendars, with the northern kingdom's new year starting in the spring and the southern kingdom's starting in the fall. He was able to reconcile the biblical data with the non-biblical sources. Thiel's chronology has been criticized on numerous points, but none of the criticisms have been strong enough to tank the whole thing. The most persistent criticism has been his use of inductive reasoning. That is, coming up with a theory based on the data, rather than coming up with a theory and testing it against the data. For about a century prior to his work's publication, scholarly attitudes towards the period of the two kingdoms had become very disparaging, with many considering the period to be fictional. But after his work, the biblical record on the period became far more trusted. It's because of this that I am using Thiel's chronology as the basis for this video.
The history of the kingdoms of Judah and Israel have served as both guidebooks and cautionary tales for the leaders of Abrahamic countries for centuries.
It's a sorry tale, using the slow deaths of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah as instruments of divine retribution, the fate of hapless kings who had not kept Jehovah's law. Ancient Israel always appears like this in the records of other nations. A collection of cities struggling to survive on the crossroads of an increasingly embattled ancient East that is finally defeated and loses everything. After the death of Solomon, a civil war broke out between his successor Rehoboam and one of his ministers, Jeroboam, who led 10 northern tribes into rebellion against the monarchy, controlled by the tribe of Judah and supported by the tribe of Benjamin. Rehoboam tried to regain control of the north, but thanks to an invasion from Egypt, he wasn't able to. Throughout the histories in the Hebrew Bible, we see an emphasis on the religiosity of the kings of both Judah and Israel, and the fate of their kingdoms are tied to their following the laws of God. This tells us that the biblical sources were most likely written by members of the priestly class who would have been most concerned with proper worship practices. The northern kingdom of Israel is said to have been directed away from strict worship of Yahweh under Jeroboam, where he established rival worship sites at Dan and Bethel, which had connections with the patriarchs as well as the prophet Samuel. He is said to have revived worship of the golden calves at these sites. Throughout these histories, we see later kings embrace worship of Canaanite deities such as Baal and Moloch. Now, some would argue that this could just be Judean propaganda, but I think there is more to it than that.
In previous installments of this series, I have mentioned that archaeologists have found inside of Israelite worship sites depictions and names of numerous other gods other than Yahweh.
And throughout the Hebrew Bible, we see a consistent pattern of the Israelites straying away from monotheistic worship of Yahweh or engaging in other pagan practices, such as when King Saul is said to have summoned the spirit of the dead prophet Samuel.
Between all the archaeological evidence and the biblical narrative constantly talking about the Israelites relapsing into idolatry over and over again, I am inclined to believe the stories of these kings pushing the worship of other deities as either being true itself or being reflective of the reality that most Israelites in both the northern and southern kingdom were not worshiping Yahweh in the means ordained by the temple priests.
One of the more infamous examples of this is the reign of King Ahab, who built a temple to Baal in the northern capital of Samaria. This is said to have happened due to his marriage to a foreign princess, Jezebel, from Phoenicia. In the Bible, Baal and Moloch worship is said to have involved human sacrifice, and numerous Israelite kings are said to have sacrificed their own children to them. The Baal temples had their own priests and prophets, and they would be asked about major policy decisions, such as when King Ahab asked them if it was safe for him and King Jehoshaphat of Judah to go into battle against the king of Damascus. The Bible makes sure the readers know that this was a mistake, pointing to Ahab's death in that battle, which had been predicted by a prophet of Yahweh, Micaiah. The kings of both north and south are said to have led their people astray from temple religious practices, such as when King Jehoram of Judah married Athaliah, the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. Under her influence, Jehoram is said to have introduced Baal worship to Judah, had his brothers killed, and after his own death have his grandchildren killed. Luckily for the house of Judah, there was one survivor, Joash, on whose behalf Athaliah would be dethroned 7 years later. The two kingdoms had a complex foreign policy, not only with each other, but with their neighbors as well. The United Kingdom of Israel was established in the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse, when all the more powerful neighboring civilizations were trying to find their footing again. But as the United Monarchy fell, the neighboring powers began to reassert themselves. First there were the Egyptians coming from the south, and from the north we saw the Assyrians, and all the smaller states in the Levant had to deal with them and each other. We see numerous alliances, betrayals, subjugations, and revolts between them as they struggle for dominance. To the north we have the Phoenician states and the kingdom of Aram-Damascus. To the east we have the kingdoms of Ammon and Moab. To the south we have the Edomites, and to the southwest we have the Philistines. Israel spends much of its history fighting with Aram-Damascus, all the while making alliances with the Phoenicians. The kingdom of Judah fought wars with all of its neighbors, and occasionally made alliances with Israel.
Many of the Judean kings are portrayed as being somewhat naive about the prospects of North and South reuniting, and you couldn't be blamed if, as a reader, you felt the same way as those kings did. And do you know what else is naive? Me believing that YouTube is going to give you a mid-roll right now. And if YouTube didn't just give you a mid-roll right then and there, then I would like to encourage you guys to click that like button. It tells YouTube that you enjoy the content from this channel and would like to see more of it on your homepage and recommended feeds. So, go ahead and do that, and now that that's out of the way, let's get back to the story of the Judean kings.
There were the direct attempts at reunifying by force under Jeroboam and his immediate successors. Jehoshaphat sent missionaries into Israel in order to bring some of the northern tribes back to proper worship of Yahweh. He also had an alliance with Ahab, and despite a prophet from his own religion telling him not to go into battle, he still did, in order to pursue that elusive dream of reunification. And this dream of reunification goes badly with the marriage pact between the children of Jehoshaphat and Ahab.
This idea of unity between North and South prior to the death of Solomon is another case in which we should probably keep in mind the sources that we are using. The books of Kings and Chronicles, as well as the many books of the prophets that intersect with that history, were written by the Judean priestly class, which means not only were they more concerned with the religiosity of their subjects, but they're also coming at it from the perspective of someone from the south. Emphasizing how similar two or more groups are is a usual way of justifying why those groups should be under the same political leadership. However, the Bible is probably emphasizing the similarities between North and South more than there probably were.
There is no doubt that the two Iron Age states, Israel and Judah, had much in common. Both worshipped Yahweh among other deities. Their people shared many legends, heroes, and tales about a common ancient past. They also spoke similar languages or dialects of Hebrew, and by the 8th century BCE, both wrote in the same script. But they were also very different from each other in their demographic composition, economic potential, material culture, and relationship with their neighbors. Put simply, Israel and Judah experienced quite different histories and developed distinctive cultures.
Another important difference between the two is that of political stability. You see, the southern kingdom remained under a single dynasty until the Babylonian conquest, but the northern kingdom was facing constant assassinations and coups.
The growing instability of the northern kingdom intersected with the growing power of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, who invaded and conquered many of its neighbors. At this point, politics in both kingdoms became centered around pro- and anti-Assyrian factions. Do you try to play nice with the Assyrians, becoming tributary or vassal states, or do you resist and face obliteration? The end for the northern kingdom came with the fall of the Gadi dynasty. King Pekahiah was assassinated by one of his generals, Pekah, who proclaimed himself king. Pekah had been part of the anti-Assyrian faction and wanted to join in a greater revolt against the Assyrians. Most of the regional powers at this point, including Judah, were either tributary or vassal states. He joined an allied revolt against the Assyrians, but he would be replaced as monarch by another military leader, Hoshea. The biblical record claims that Hoshea initiated a rebellion against Pekah, while the Assyrian records claim that they had placed Hoshea on the throne after an unrelated rebellion. Either way, by this point, the kingdom of Israel had been reduced to a vassal state, consisting of little more than the city of Samaria. Late in his reign, Hoshea decided to quit paying tribute to the Assyrians. The reason why is uncertain. Either the Egyptians offered him support if he chose to revolt, or he requested aid from the Egyptians in order to revolt. Either way, Egypt was in the middle of its own civil war at this time with multiple competing dynasties, and so they were unable to assist. With this last act of defiance, the Assyrians came and crushed what was left of Israel, scattering its peoples across the empire, destroying their identities.
The kings of Judah continued the usual pattern of one king restoring proper religious practices and then one of his successors bringing back the cult of Baal. And of course, just like the north, the south also had to deal with the rise of the Neo-Assyrian Empire and had to deal with pro- and anti-Assyrian factions in the court.
Under the reign of Hezekiah, they built new fortifications around Jerusalem, and even plotted numerous rebellions against the Assyrians, but none of them ever came to pass. During a routine campaign against the Egyptians, the Assyrians decided to besiege Jerusalem, knowing of their past attempts at plotting rebellions. The Assyrian army would have captured Jerusalem, and dealt the same fate as had befallen Samaria. But the Bible describes an instance of divine intervention that caused the Assyrians to withdraw. That night, the angel of the Lord went out and put to death 185,000 in the Assyrian camp. When the people got up the next morning, there were all the dead bodies.
The death toll nor any kind of defeat are mentioned in the Assyrian records, but this wouldn't be unusual for rulers at the time to exclude defeats in their official records. However, the Greek historian Herodotus offers another explanation. Plague.
In his account of the Assyrian invasion of Egypt, a horde of mice enveloped the Assyrian army and chewed away at the ropes and straps of their weapons, causing them to retreat. Most historians have interpreted this as the Assyrian army being hit by some kind of plague carried on rodents. One can then assume that by the time this army reached Jerusalem on its return home, it had been hit pretty hard by the plague, and it's possible that at some point the plague casualties got a lot worse while besieging Jerusalem, causing them to retreat. Despite this victory, the kingdom of Judah was reduced to the land around the city of Jerusalem. The Neo-Assyrian Empire would fall less than a century later, due to a combination of civil wars and revolts. Under King Josiah, the Judeans attempted to revolt, but they were defeated by an Egyptian army at Megiddo in 609 that was on its way to aid the Assyrians. But both of them would lose to the Babylonians at the Battle of Haran, thereby putting an end to the final independent Assyrian state to ever exist. And here we find Jerusalem as the last Israelite kingdom standing.
And that is where we are ending the history for this video. So, I want to say thank you guys for watching. I noticed there's about 1,000 extra subscribers in the last week or two, and so I want to say welcome. These are the kinds of videos I make, and I hope you're enjoying them. And if you want to make sure that you keep seeing them, then I suggest on top of subscribing, you also click that like button as I mentioned earlier, as well as clicking the bell icon to turn on notifications. Because, of course, as you've heard every YouTuber say, we never know when something on YouTube is going to break. I'd also like to thank my generous patrons for helping make this video possible. Thanks to their support, I can focus more on making the videos that I would like to make rather than what might please a hypothetical algorithm. So, thank you. If you want to learn more about becoming a patron, then you can go to patreon.com/casualhistorian. Other ways of helping the channel are listed down in the description below. And if financially assisting is out of your reach, that is perfectly fine. At the end of the day, the best way to help a channel grow is to watch the videos all the way through and share them. So, do that, and I'm a happy camper. Thanks for watching, and I will see you guys next time.